So we're continuing to go through and talk about St. Ignatius Loyola's rules for discernment of spirits to help us be able to recognize God's voice in our prayers and in our daily life, and also be able to recognize, the pitfalls that the enemy may try to throw out there. So the first two rules were all about the two paths, whether we're following God or not following Him. Depending upon the direction, God and the enemy act differently. So when we're on the path following God, God wants to keep us on that path by giving us encouragement, strengthening us. What we talked about last time, His consolations. That's wonderful to reflect on the consolations, because when we receive those gifts, when He decides to give them to us, those are beautiful and wonderful to receive. But we don't always have consolations. Sometimes we have those great moments of experiencing God. A lot of times just kind of normal life. But then we can also experience the much more difficult things, what we're going to talk about today, the spiritual desolations. So when we're on that path trying to follow the Lord, the enemy, Satan, fallen angels, he is going to want to try to get us off that path, right? He does not want us following the Lord. And so he's going to place obstacles. He's going to try to bring confusion, questions, disquiet, fear, feeling like God's not there, all these kinds of things to try to stop us from continuing on, try to discourage us. And so all these things are called spiritual desolations. And just like in the third rule, St. Ignatius gave us a number of examples to help us reflect what do consolations look like. He's going to do the same thing here in his fourth rule. He's going to give us examples of what spiritual desolation looks like. So, look at some of his examples. The first one, he says, is darkness of soul. So, these are times when we can't get things figured out, when we're confused, when we don't understand what's going on, especially with our relationship with God and our spiritual life. There's a kind of heaviness, that things are going badly, but we're not sure that they're ever going to get better. Maybe we just feel like they're just going to keep getting worse, right? This kind of darkness. We can't see the way forward. He connects that to disturbance within the soul. Our peace is gone. We feel troubled. Maybe we try to pray, but there's so many other things on our mind that we're anxious about, that we're concerned about, that it's really hard to focus. Maybe you try to go to church, you try to read the Bible, go to Bible study, but the enjoyment, the delight that you had at other times is just completely gone, and you just don't feel like participating anymore. These are moments of desolation, and it's important that we name them. Before I go any further with more examples, the experience of desolation is a normal thing for us to experience. There's no shame in it. Desolation of itself is not sinful. Sometimes it makes us susceptible to sin. We'll see that here in a second. But desolation of itself is just a normal thing we go through. Even the greatest saints went through moments of desolation. So, the next example that he gives is movement toward low and earthly things. So, a number of examples of how this manifests in our life. But say, for example, we're alone at the end of the day. It's been quite exhausting. Maybe things didn't go quite as well as you wanted at work, or things that you need to get done around the home. Maybe it's with relationships. Things are a little bit rocky with certain individuals. There's a kind of heaviness, a grayness within our heart. Normally, at the end of the day, you'd pray, but you have no desire for it at this moment. And instead, there, just a few inches away from you, is your phone. And 1 minute leads to 2 minutes, which leads to 5 minutes, which leads to 10 minutes, which leads to half an hour, and maybe even takes us to places where we never wanted to go, right? This draw to low and earthly things. These are times when we feel this urge to move toward various gratifications. Going to the fridge a second, a third time. Getting up from the TV hours later. This pull toward low and earthly things that, after being drawn to that, we find that they just continue to leave us empty overall. Movement toward low and earthly things. The next example that he gives is, he says, disquiet from various agitations and temptations. So once again, this can manifest in various ways within our life. This kind of just things are off within. But also he notes temptations specifically. Remember, temptations in and of themselves aren't sin, but they can lead us to that. So these are times, for example, maybe you have memories of past sins that arise. And maybe recently those kind of habits you haven't really struggled with, but now during this kind of time of desolation within our heart, these temptations again become strong within us. During times of desolation, we're much more susceptible to falling into temptations like that. And the enemy knows how to manipulate these things against us. He knows what our weaknesses are. Another example is moving to lack of confidence without hope, without love. So maybe, say for example, someone's used to praying regularly, but recently prayers kind of felt dry, like nothing's happening. You're not really hearing God at all. And you still try to pray, but a few minutes into your prayer, the thoughts arise of all the other things that you need to get done and accomplished. And you're like, what am I doing here? This is just a waste of time. It's not like God's going to say anything anyway. So there's this complete lack of confidence or hope that God can do anything for us. Another example that he gives is finding oneself totally slothful, tepid, and sad. Remember, sloth is kind of a spiritual laziness or sadness. So maybe the last several weeks we're worried about something, things going on in the family, finances, illnesses, whatever it might be. We'll see here in a second. I'll talk more about it. But the kind of normal kind of negative things that happen in our life, we might call non-spiritual desolations, can affect our relationship with God on the spiritual level. And so oftentimes they can be connected. So maybe these kinds of things have been happening in our life, and maybe that's led our prayer to kind of slip by the wayside. And some of the spiritual practices I normally would do haven't really been a part of what I've been doing recently. And in this, maybe a day approaches where previously, when we had been praying more, we had made some kind of commitment, like being a part of a small group during Lent, or going to Sunday Sparks, or other kind of Bible study, or something like that. And we get to that moment, and the day approaches, but we have no energy for it, right? We just feel totally slothful, sad about doing the things of the Lord. Maybe it's, active service in some aspect of the parish, right? When we get to that event, I don't feel like doing it at all, right? Maybe I just won't go. This is a moment of spiritual desolation. And then a final example that he gives is feeling as if separated from one's Creator and Lord. So feeling like God has abandoned you, that you're isolated, that you're alone. And it's important to note here what Ignatius says. The way he says it, he says, as feeling as if separated from God. Because the reality is this isn't true. This is the case with, all these desolations. If there's some kind of lie that the father of lies is stuck into all this, right, that is trying to convince us to believe. But this is one of the most insidious and worst of the lies of desolation, to try to convince us that we're alone, that God has abandoned us. And if anything is things are going bad, and if anything's going to change in my life, it's all up to me because I'm by myself. I've got to do it all. And if we believe this desolation, we remain captive by the enemy. Our heart will remain heavy. But it's not what God desires for us. The reality is that we are not separated from God. During these times, we just don't feel the closeness like we did in times of consolation. So we need to learn to reject this as not from God, but from the enemy. So these different descriptions are examples of spiritual desolations, are not the only examples that we can have. Also mentioned that these spiritual desolations can also come about from non-spiritual desolations. So just ordinary sadness, tiredness, ordinary kind of, depression in our life, a heaviness of heart. Spiritual desolation is that heaviness on the level of our relationship with God, whereas all these other things may not have to do anything with God, but they can very quickly become related to one another. It doesn't take but a small step from feeling just physically worn out, tired mentally, emotionally depressed, to thoughts like, I don't feel like praying. Why am I bothering trying to do this for the parish? Does God really care? Suddenly it becomes desolation on the level of our relationship with God. Generally, those two, spiritual and non-spiritual desolations, they can often come hand in hand. And a non-spiritual desolation can be the seedbed for the spiritual one if it affects the way we look at our relationship with God. But that also means, thankfully, that sometimes spiritual problems can resolve if we pay wise attention to the non-spiritual level of our humanity, right? If we begin to pay attention to the rest or exercise or, good eating habits that we need to take care of our physical selves, it can also help us in our spiritual selves. So these are just a few examples of spiritual desolation. We want to learn to recognize the kinds of desolations that the enemy exploits that he knows that we're most susceptible to. There's certain lies that probably we can fall into the most easily, certain moments where we become more susceptible to certain temptations. Now, it's important to note, to realize that when we're experiencing this, there's no shame in it again. We're all going to experience it, but they don't come from God. God gives us consolation. He will allow us to go through desolation for various reasons, and that the reasons why we'll talk about in the coming rules. He explains those things. But this desolation really is the main obstacle to our spiritual growth. So we need to learn how to recognize it and then what to do from the midst of it. And the coming rules will help us to do that. Rules coming up, for example, like, we shouldn't make changes to our spiritual commitments when we're in desolation. We should resist desolation through prayer, through meditation, through examining where that desolation comes from, through small acts of penance. We should consider how God is sufficient for us during those times of desolation, even though we don't tangibly feel His presence, and know that the desolation doesn't last forever. So those are coming principles that we'll talk about in future sparks. I'm going to give a couple final examples of what we find in the Scriptures about desolation. For example, when Israel came forth from Egypt, Jacob's sons from an alien people, it says in Psalm 114, when they were coming forth out of Egypt, they had just experienced all God's mighty deeds, His power in freeing them from slavery. And so this would have been a time of spiritual desolation. They'd just seen all these wonderful things God had done for them. But as soon as they crossed over the sea, they now faced the expanse of the desert. They had to travel through the harsh winds, the blowing sands, the beating suns. Food and water were now very scarce. They had to walk and walk and walk with not knowing where they were going. And so you can imagine the kind of heaviness, the hopelessness, the discouragement, the depression that would come upon them. And that's why they began to complain. Why did we ever leave Egypt? We were better off there. Does God really care about us? Maybe He just wants us to die of thirst, right? Certainly a heavy desolation that they're in. Maybe we can think of moments that we get into that in our own life, where we begin to think thoughts that maybe God really isn't listening, that maybe Jesus doesn't really care, maybe He's not as real as our faith claims that He is. And this is spiritual desolation that we should resist. Final example is when Jesus meets the woman at the well in the Gospels. This Samaritan woman was experiencing desolation in her life. She had been married 5 times at this point. Imagine what must have happened to lead to that divorce after divorce, the failure of her first marriage that put her in such a state that made her susceptible to more unhealthy relationships, searching for love and happiness in all the wrong ways with all the wrong individuals, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. Now she was cohabitating with a man whom she was not married. And because of all these things that happened to her and her choices she had made, she was now shunned by her community and forced to go to the well in the middle of the hottest part of the day. Unwanted by so many, we can imagine that how did she feel about God? Certainly, how could God want her when nobody else did either? But in the gospel, it shows us that Jesus comes to meet her and us in the midst of spiritual desolation, to draw her out of that. And He brings her the water of His grace, His consolations that we talked about last time. Jesus knows, like He knew for her, He knows all that we've ever done and gone through. And He comes to draw us out of desolation. Ask, and He will give you life-giving water. So next Sunday Sparks, we're going to consider the next 2 rules, 5 and 6. which begin to apply what do we do during times of desolation? How do we act when we're faced with it? How to reject the bad and accept the good.